The cruel reality of New Year's celebrations in Victorian England. Boring history for sleep. They called it a Happy New Year, but if you had stepped onto a fog-choked London street on the night of December 31st, 1843, you might have laughed at the joke. Or cried. Church bells rang overhead, hollow and distant, cutting through coal smoke so thick it felt like the city itself was coughing. Somewhere, a crowd sang out of tune, drunk on cheap gin and colder hopes. This is the version of history nobody puts on greeting cards. Welcome to Victorian England's New Year's Eve, where celebration and suffering slept in the same bed. From the outside, the Victorians loved appearances. Respectability was currency. Middle-class families polished their brass doorknobs, scrubbed their children's faces raw, and gathered around fireplaces to read moral poetry and exchange carefully worded resolutions. Newspapers ran syrupy editorials about renewal, discipline, and God's favor in the coming year. On paper, it all looked wholesome, comforting, almost boring. But that's exactly where boring history lies to you. Step just a few streets away from those candlelit parlors, and the illusion shattered. In the slums of London, places like St. Giles, Whitechapel, and Seven Dials, New Year's wasn't a fresh start. It was a reminder that nothing had changed. Families packed into single rooms, sometimes 10 people to a space meant for 2. The air smelled of sewage and damp rot. Children slept 3 to a bed, if they slept at all. For them, January 1st didn't mean hope. It meant winter tightening its grip, and winter in Victorian England was a killer. Coal was expensive, food prices spiked, wages didn't. By New Year's Eve, many laborers had already pawned their coats, their blankets, even their shoes. Frostbitten feet were common. So was hunger. The poor didn't toast the new year with champagne. They counted how many potatoes were left and whether the workhouse doors would open before someone collapsed. Yet here's the first twist. New Year's Eve was dangerous precisely because it was supposed to be joyful. Gin shops stayed open late, packed wall to wall. Victorian reformers called gin the devil's milk, and on New Year's Eve, the devil ate well. Men drank to forget debts they couldn't pay. Women drank to numb grief they weren't allowed to speak aloud. Violence spiked. Police blotters from the era show a sharp rise in assaults, domestic abuse, and arrests as the clock crept toward midnight. Celebration didn't erase misery. It poured fuel on it. Meanwhile, the upper classes played a different game. In grand townhouses, New Year's parties glittered with music, roast meats, and imported wines. Guests discussed empire, industry, and progress, how Britain stood at the center of the world. They believed history itself was marching forward and that they were leading the parade. At midnight, they raised glasses and congratulated one another for surviving another year of success. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Their comfort depended on the suffering outside their windows. Factories didn't pause for holidays. Child labor didn't take a night off. Coal mines swallowed boys as young as 8, even on January 1st. While elites talked about moral improvement, the working poor were treated as expendable machinery. New Year's resolutions were a luxury item. And yet, this is where the story gets stranger. The Victorians knew something was wrong. Pamphlets circulated warning that unchecked poverty would rot the nation from the inside. Preachers thundered about charity from their pulpits. Writers like Charles Dickens turned New Year's into a moral battleground, forcing readers to confront the cost of indifference. A Christmas Carol didn't end on December 25th. It haunted the entire season, including the turn of the year. The ghost of social guilt lingered long after the carols stopped. So New Year's Eve became a pressure cooker. Hope and despair, charity and cruelty, celebration and collapse, all colliding at midnight. When the bells rang to welcome the new year, they rang for everyone, but not everyone heard the same promise. For some, the sound meant renewal. For others, it meant one more year survived, barely. And for many, it meant nothing at all, because survival had already failed them. This is the brutal reality of Victorian New Year's celebrations. Not cozy, not charming, not safe. And we're just getting started. Because once the fireworks fade and the morning of January 1st arrives, the real reckoning begins. Inside the workhouses, the prisons, and the quiet, desperate resolutions whispered by people who knew the system was rigged against them. As the clock crept closer to midnight, Victorian England dressed itself in the costume of joy. Gas lamps flickered like tired stars. Shop windows glowed with polished brass and false cheer, and the streets hummed with the low murmur of expectation. On the surface, New Year's Eve looked festive enough to fool a passing observer. But step closer, and the illusion cracked. This was not a night of carefree celebration. It was a night thick with exhaustion, hunger, and social performance, where joy was often borrowed, not owned. In middle-class parlors, families gathered around coal fires that burned just hot enough to keep the room tolerable. Tea was poured carefully, because sugar was still expensive, and every spoon mattered. There were no fireworks timed to explode at midnight, no champagne towers, no universal countdown. Instead, there was waiting. Waiting for the clock. Waiting for the year to turn. Waiting for something, anything, to feel different. Victorian life was rigid, repetitive, and heavy. And New Year's Eve carried the quiet pressure of hope that tomorrow might be lighter, even if experience suggested otherwise. Outside these warm rooms, the streets told a harsher story. London's poor did not wait for midnight with optimism. For them, the turning of the year meant unpaid rent, rising bread prices, and another cycle of survival. Shelters overflowed on New Year's Eve. Charitable missions opened their doors wider than usual, offering thin soup and harder prayers. This was one of the few nights when society briefly acknowledged the people it usually stepped over. But acknowledgement was not the same as relief. The soup ran out. The prayers ended. January came anyway. Here's the first twist most people miss. Victorian New Year's celebrations were not loud because people were happy. They were loud because silence was terrifying. Noise meant life. Noise meant warmth. Noise meant you were not alone with your thoughts. Taverns filled quickly as night fell, especially in industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham. Workers, already worn down by 14-hour shifts, drank not to celebrate the future, but to numb the present. Gin was cheap. Hope was not. And the authorities knew this. Police patrols doubled on New Year's Eve. Magistrates expected an increase in violence, domestic disputes, and public disorder. Hospital records from the era show a spike in injuries during the holiday, not from accidents of joy, but from fights fueled by alcohol and frustration. The new year did not reset tempers. It exposed them. Meanwhile, the upper class performed celebration as theater. Grand homes hosted formal gatherings with carefully planned menus and strict social rules. There were no wild dances or uninhibited laughter. Respectability mattered more than enjoyment. Guests discussed politics, empire, and moral progress, all while pretending not to notice how desperately they were clinging to tradition. Midnight arrived not with screams, but with polite applause or a solemn toast. The future was something to manage, not embrace. And then there were the servants, the invisible backbone of every celebration. While others waited for midnight, servants worked through it. They poured drinks, cleared plates, kept fires alive, and smiled when spoken to. New Year's Eve did not belong to them. January 1st was not a fresh start. It was just another morning where they woke before dawn and did it all again. If Victorian England ran on steam, it was fueled by people who never got to stop. This is where the story takes a darker turn. The Victorians believed deeply in moral accounting. A good year was earned through discipline and suffering. Pleasure, especially excessive pleasure, was suspicious. So even on the one night meant to celebrate renewal, restraint ruled. Too much laughter suggested weakness. Too much drinking suggested moral failure. The new year was supposed to improve you, not delight you. And that belief quietly poisoned the celebration itself. As midnight passed, church bells rang across cities and villages. Their sound was heavy, echoing through fog and narrow streets. For some, it meant hope. For others, it sounded like a reminder. Time was moving, whether you were ready or not. The bells did not care if you were rich or poor, warm or freezing, hopeful or broken. They rang anyway. And when the echoes faded, something unsettling remained. The realization that the year had changed, but life, for most Victorians, had not. The illusion of merriment slipped away. Fires burned lower. Taverns emptied into cold streets. The poor returned to overcrowded rooms. The rich retired to quiet bedrooms. And England, bruised but familiar, stepped into another year exactly as it had left the last. By the time the church bells rang out across Victorian England, the night had already gone sideways. New Year's Eve was supposed to be about renewal, but in the narrow streets of London, Manchester, and Birmingham, it often felt more like a slow-burning fuse. The cold pressed in hard, the kind of cold that crawled into bones and refused to leave, and people poured into the streets not because they were joyful, but because their homes were colder, darker, and lonelier than the night outside. Gas lamps flickered like tired stars. Shadows stretched unnaturally long along brick walls blackened by soot. And everywhere, there was fire. Bonfires were common, especially in working-class districts. Old furniture, broken crates, rotting wood, sometimes even stolen fencing was dragged into the streets and set alight. Fire meant warmth. Fire meant light. Fire meant control, even if just for one night. But fire in Victorian England was never just fire. It was danger dressed up as celebration. The flames cracked and popped, sending sparks into the air, landing on coats soaked in coal dust and oil. Children ran too close. Drunk men stumbled too near. And when fires spread, and they often did, there was no emergency number to call, no rapid response brigade racing in with sirens. Volunteer fire crews had to be found, assembled, paid, and convinced to act. By the time they arrived, entire rows of houses could already be gone. New Year's fires didn't just destroy buildings, they erased lives. And then there were the fireworks. Primitive, unpredictable, and terrifying by modern standards. Gunpowder-packed rockets were sold cheaply on street corners with zero regulation. No safety rules, no age limits, just fire and hope. People lost fingers, lost eyes, lost faces. Newspapers the next morning treated it casually, as if mutilation was just part of the holiday package. But the real danger wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological, social. Because beneath the noise and smoke, Victorian New Year's carried a darker tradition, sanctioned chaos. For one night, behavior that would normally get you arrested or beaten was tolerated. Crowds surged through streets shouting, singing, banging pots and pans. It was called making a din, and it was supposed to chase away bad spirits from the old year. In reality, it chased away restraint. Women were harassed openly. Shop windows were smashed as a joke. Fights broke out constantly, fueled by cheap gin and frustration built up over 12 months of grinding poverty. Police often stood back, overwhelmed or unwilling to step into mobs that outnumbered them 10 to 1. And for the poorest families, New Year's wasn't a celebration at all. It was a reckoning. Landlords still expected rent on January 1st. Employers still demanded labor at dawn. The calendar flipped, but nothing else changed. If anything, the new year felt like a threat. Another year survived, but barely. Another year of hunger, illness, and loss looming ahead. So people drank harder, louder, wilder. Gin palaces overflowed, their windows glowing warm and golden like promises they couldn't keep. Inside, bodies packed shoulder to shoulder, breath fogging the air, floors slick with spilled alcohol. The sound was deafening, laughter that bordered on hysteria, songs shouted more than sung, arguments that could turn violent in seconds. For many, this was the only night they felt visible. And that's the twist no one tells you. Victorian New Year's wasn't about joy. It was about release. A pressure valve on a society stretched to its breaking point. The fires, the noise, the chaos, they weren't traditions. They were symptoms. When midnight finally hit, when the bells thundered and the crowd screamed, "Happy New Year," something strange happened. For a brief moment, everything stopped. People hugged strangers, enemies clinked glasses. Tears ran freely down faces hardened by survival. And then, just as fast, it was over. The fires burned low, the crowds thinned, the streets filled with ash, broken glass, and unconscious bodies left where they fell. By morning, carts would come to collect the dead. Those who froze, overdosed, were trampled, or simply drank themselves into silence. Newspapers would call it high spirits. Clergy would call it moral decay. The wealthy would call it working class excess. But the truth was simpler and far darker. Victorian England didn't celebrate the new year because it was happy. It celebrated because it was desperate. And as the smoke cleared and the cold returned, one thing became painfully clear. The new year had arrived, but mercy had not. By the time New Year's Eve slid into its final hours, Victorian England did not sparkle. It smothered. The air itself seemed tired, thick, heavy. If you stood on a London street as the year died, you did not look up to see fireworks. You looked through smoke, coal smoke, factory smoke, chimney smoke, a gray-black blanket that pressed down on the city like a bad dream that refused to lift. This was not the romantic fog of paintings and postcards. This was industrial smog, so dense it swallowed gas lamps whole. The yellow glow that was meant to guide people home became blurry halos floating in the dark, like ghosts that had forgotten where they belonged. On New Year's Eve, every home burned extra coal to stay warm. Every tavern burned more fuel. Every factory pushed harder before the holiday pause. The result was a city choking on its own ambition. People coughed as they walked. Children rubbed their eyes raw. The smell of sulfur clung to clothes, hair, and skin. By midnight, London did not smell like celebration. It smelled like ash and exhaustion. Historians would later write about pea soup fogs, but for the Victorians, this was just normal. Another price of progress, another invisible tax paid with lungs instead of coins. Inside the houses, things were not much better. Fireplaces roared, but heat was uneven. One side of the room burned, the other froze. Families crowded close, not just for warmth, but because the walls themselves seemed to sweat cold. Windows rattled under winter winds, curtains trapped smoke inside instead of letting it escape. And somewhere, Always, somewhere, there was the faint crackle of something burning that should not be. Fire was a constant fear on New Year's Eve. Candles were everywhere, on tables, windowsills, staircases. Decorations were dry, flammable, and often homemade. Evergreen branches, ribbons, paper stars. One careless sleeve. One knocked-over candle. One drunk guest laughing too hard. Houses went up fast in those days, and fire brigades were slow, underfunded, and exhausted by winter. New Year's Eve fires were so common that newspapers barely treated them as news unless someone important died. Entire families could lose everything between one year and the next, watching their home collapse into sparks while neighbors stood helplessly in the street. For many Victorians, the new year did not begin with hope. It began with ash. Outside, the streets grew louder as midnight approached. Taverns overflowed. Men stumbled into alleys to vomit or fight. The police, few, poorly equipped, and underpaid, did what they could, which mostly meant breaking up brawls and dragging unconscious bodies out of the road. Celebrations mixed freely with violence. Cheers turned into shouts. Songs turned into threats. The line between joy and chaos was paper thin. And yet, beneath all of this noise and smoke, there was an eerie quiet waiting its turn. At the exact moment the old year ended, church bells rang out across the city. Deep, slow, heavy. The sound rolled through the smog like thunder underwater. For a brief moment, people stopped shouting. Tavern doors paused mid-slam. Fights hesitated. Even the drunkest revelers seemed to freeze, caught between years, between mistakes already made and promises they would never keep. That pause mattered. Victorians believed time itself had power. Midnight was not just a number. It was a doorway. A moment when fate listened more closely than usual. Some whispered prayers. Some made vows. Some simply stood still, afraid that moving might somehow curse the year ahead. But the pause never lasted. Within seconds, noise crashed back in, louder than before. Bottles shattered. Someone fired a pistol into the air. Bells clanged wildly now, less solemn, more chaotic. The new year did not arrive gently. It burst in, coughing through smoke, stumbling over broken glass, and dragging all the old problems with it. For the poor, nothing changed at all. Rent was still due. Wages were still low. Food was still scarce. The new year was a calendar trick, not a miracle. For the rich, celebrations blurred together into hangovers and gossip, their resolutions forgotten by morning. Hope existed, but it was fragile, thin as the gaslight struggling to glow through the smog. And somewhere in the city, as the bells faded and the fires burned low, a different kind of New Year's ritual began. One that had nothing to do with parties or prayers. A ritual of survival. Because when morning came, Victorian England would wake up not to a fresh start, but to the consequences of the night before. And those consequences were often brutal. By the time midnight crept closer in Victorian England, the city didn't sparkle. It suffocated. London on New Year's Eve was wrapped in smoke so thick it felt alive. Coal fires burned nonstop in homes, factories, bakeries, and pubs. The air wasn't crisp winter cold. It was heavy, oily, and bitter. Gas lamps glowed like tired eyes through the fog, barely strong enough to cut the darkness. Streets twisted into shadows. Sounds traveled strangely. A laugh here, a shout there, then vanished, swallowed whole. This wasn't a festive hush. It was a city holding its breath. For the wealthy, this hour meant retreat. Doors shut, curtains drawn, servants dismissed to their cramped quarters. Gentlemen checked locks twice. Ladies counted silverware. New Year's Eve wasn't just a celebration. It was a night of anxiety. Crime always spiked. Drunk laborers, desperate pickpockets, street gangs hunting opportunity. The poor had nothing to lose, and the rich knew it. Outside, the working class filled the streets not with joy, but with momentum. Alehouses overflowed. Gin flowed cheap and fast. Voices grew louder, rougher, less controlled. Songs drifted through alleyways, not cheerful carols, but crude ballads about hunger, loss, and bad luck. This was the sound of people who knew tomorrow would look exactly like today. And somewhere between the taverns and the tenements, children wandered. Victorian London was full of them. Newsboys, match girls, bootblacks, kids who worked by day and survived by night. New Year's Eve meant longer hours, more drunk men to dodge, more hands grabbing, more risks. Some hoped for a generous penny. Others just wanted shelter from the cold. No countdown awaited them. Midnight wasn't magic. It was dangerous. Police patrols moved slowly, lanterns swinging. The Metropolitan Police were still a young institution, understaffed and overstretched. They couldn't protect everyone. They barely protected anyone. Most crimes went unreported. Most victims stayed silent. This was a city where survival mattered more than justice. As the hour crept toward 12, church bells began to stir. Not all at once. Not in harmony. One bell would ring, then another blocks away, then another. Uneven, echoing, eerie. The sound rolled across rooftops like a warning rather than a welcome. To some, it meant hope. To others, it sounded like time mocking them. Another year gone. Nothing fixed. Inside workhouses, bells rang too. But there, they marked routine, not renewal. The poor didn't celebrate the turning of the year. They endured it. Gruel was served. Lights dimmed. Silence followed. You were expected to be grateful you were alive. Anything more was considered indulgence. Meanwhile, behind polished doors, the upper class pretended optimism. Champagne corks popped softly. Toasts were made to progress and prosperity. But even there, smiles were tight. The economy was unstable. Factories rose and fell overnight. Empires stretched thin. The future felt uncertain, even to those with everything. And that's the twisted truth of Victorian New Year's Eve. It united no one. The rich feared the poor resented the rich. Children slipped through the cracks. Authorities watched from the sidelines. The city rang in the new year fractured, unequal, and exhausted. As midnight finally struck, there were no fireworks lighting the sky. No crowds screaming countdowns. No confetti raining down. Just bells, smoke, footsteps, and the quiet realization that January 1st wouldn't change a thing. And that's where the real brutality lived. Not in violence alone, but in repetition. Because when the bells stopped ringing, Victorian England didn't wake up reborn. It woke up the same. By the time the clock crawled past midnight, the magic of New Year's Eve in Victorian England was already wearing thin. This wasn't the clean, cinematic ending people imagine. This was the after. And the after was rough. The fireworks faded. The church bells stopped ringing. The songs slurred into half-remembered verses. And suddenly, everyone woke up, emotionally, physically, brutally, to the same truth. Nothing had actually changed. For the upper classes, January 1st often came with headaches and embarrassment, but also with warm rooms, servants bringing tea, and heavy curtains blocking out the gray London dawn. They could sleep it off. For everyone else, there was no pause button. The poor woke up cold, hungry, and painfully aware that the new year didn't erase old debts, bad luck, or empty cupboards. Hope had been loud at midnight, but silence was louder at dawn. Walk the streets of London on New Year's morning and you'd see the evidence everywhere. Broken bottles near taverns, torn paper hats trampled into the mud, men asleep against brick walls, coats pulled tight, breath fogging the air. Women dragging children along icy streets, already late for work. The celebration had passed through the city like a storm, and now only the wreckage remained. Here's the part nobody puts in greeting cards. New Year's Day was often one of the most depressing days of the year. Victorian newspapers quietly acknowledged it. Charities saw spikes in requests for food and coal. Hospitals treated injuries from drunken falls, knife fights, and frostbite. Police reports filled with words like disturbance, vagrancy, and domestic disorder. Translation: people partied hard and paid for it immediately, and the emotional crash hit just as hard as the physical one. Victorians believed deeply in self-improvement, discipline, and moral progress. The new year was supposed to mean better behavior, but after a night of excess, many felt like they'd already failed. Resolutions were broken before breakfast. Promises to drink less, work harder, pray more. Gone in the cold daylight. Religious leaders leaned into this guilt hard. Sermons on January 1st weren't gentle. They were stern. Priests reminded congregations that time was slipping away, that each new year brought people closer to judgment, not comfort. The message was clear. You don't get a fresh start for free. You earn it. And if you woke up hungover and broke, well, that was on you. Meanwhile, factory owners and employers wasted no time. Work resumed fast. No extended holiday, no recovery day. Miss your shift because you partied too hard? You risked losing your job. Victorian capitalism didn't care about your vibes. The machine kept moving, and you either showed up or got replaced. Even kids weren't spared the reset. For many working-class children, New Year's Day meant being sent back to factories, workshops, or domestic labor. Any joy from the night before evaporated fast. Childhood wonder got replaced with routine survival. The calendar flipped, but the grind stayed exactly the same. And yet, here's the twist. This harsh reality is exactly why New Year's celebrations mattered so much. When life is relentless, even a few hours of illusion are powerful. Victorians knew the system was stacked. They knew the year ahead would be hard. That made the moment at midnight, when bells rang and people shouted and time paused, feel almost rebellious. For a brief second, everyone stood equal under the same sky, hearing the same chimes, making the same silent wish. Maybe this year will be different. Even if deep down they knew it probably wouldn't be. That's the real Victorian New Year. Not glitter and champagne, but hope fighting exhaustion. Joy wrestling reality. A society clinging to ritual because ritual was sometimes the only thing standing between despair and survival. And as the sun climbed over soot-covered rooftops, London shook itself awake, pulled its coat tighter, and marched straight back into the same old life, pretending, just a little, that something had shifted. But don't get too comfortable, because in the next part, we're diving into the quiet spaces people don't talk about. The lonely ones. The people who rang in the new year completely alone. And what that silence tells us about Victorian society. Yeah, that part hits different. By the time the clock struck midnight on New Year's Eve in Victorian England, the noise outside was wild. But inside most homes, the mood was heavy. This is where the boring history really cuts deep. While modern New Year's feels like glitter and champagne, Victorian New Year's often felt like a quiet reckoning, the kind where celebration and survival collided head-on. For the wealthy, the party didn't end at midnight. Fireworks over the Thames cracked the sky open like thunder. Champagne flowed and laughter echoed through drawing rooms filled with velvet curtains and gaslight glow. But even among the rich, there was tension. New Year's Day was a day of calling, visiting relatives, repaying social debts, proving you still belonged. Miss a visit? That could cost you your reputation. Victorian society kept score, and New Year's was when the books were checked. Now cut to the working class. No velvet, no champagne, just cold floors, damp walls, and the sound of distant celebrations mocking them through thin windows. For factory workers, dock laborers, and servants, New Year's Day was not a holiday. It was often a work day. Miss your shift, and you might not have a job by the end of January. That's the CLM history they don't teach you. The brutal economics hiding behind festive tradition. And then there were the children. Victorian children didn't stay up waiting for fireworks. Many were asleep long before midnight, not because they were tucked in, but because exhaustion won. Child labor was legal. Kids worked in mills, chimneys, and workshops. For them, the new year didn't mean fresh starts. It meant the same grind, same soot, same danger. If you survived the year, that was the win. But here's the twist. The part that makes this history perfect for a sleeping channel. Despite all this misery, Victorians were obsessed with hope. Almost aggressively hopeful. New Year's resolutions were a serious thing. Diaries from the era show people promising to drink less, work harder, pray more, and waste nothing. Waste was sin. Time was moral. Every second mattered because death was always nearby. And death showed up uninvited to many New Year's celebrations. Victorian winters were brutal. Cold meant illness. Illness meant funerals. Newspapers from January issues often listed deaths from pneumonia, influenza, and winter fevers. Imagine ringing in the new year while knowing your neighbor died overnight. That wasn't rare. It was normal. The bells that rang to celebrate sometimes rang again days later for burials. Still, the city kept moving. Street vendors sold hot chestnuts, cheap gin, and meat pies to crowds who wanted to feel warm, if only for a moment. Gin was everywhere, cheap, strong, and dangerous. Moral reformers hated it. The poor depended on it. New Year's Eve was one of the few nights people allowed themselves to forget how close the edge really was. But here's the darker turn. Many Victorians believed how you behaved on New Year's Day shaped the entire year ahead. Wake up angry? Bad luck. Start the year in debt? Misery would follow. That belief created intense pressure. Some people forced cheer. Others avoided people entirely. Superstitions ruled quietly, even in an age obsessed with progress and science. And while London celebrated, the countryside felt different. Rural families marked the new year with silence, church bells, and prayer. No fireworks, no crowds, just a deep awareness of time passing and bodies aging. Farmers watched the sky, worried about harvests months away. A bad year could mean starvation. New Year's wasn't symbolic. It was mathematical survival. This is why Victorian New Year's feels unsettling today. It wasn't about joy. It was about endurance. They celebrated not because life was good, but because they were still alive. And that's the hook people miss. Victorian England wasn't joyless, but joy was fragile. Every laugh was borrowed time. Every toast tempted fate. When the fireworks faded and the streets emptied, people went home knowing tomorrow looked exactly like yesterday. But they still hoped. And in the next part, that hope gets tested. Hard. when we step into the aftermath. The hangovers, the debts, the accidents, and the silent consequences that January always brought crashing down. That's where the real story continues. When the bells finally stopped ringing and the smoke from fireworks drifted into the cold Victorian sky, something unsettling settled in. New Year's Day was supposed to mean renewal, fresh starts, clean slates. But in Victorian England, the morning after felt less like rebirth and more like a hangover for the entire nation. This is the part no celebratory painting ever shows, the slow, brutal aftermath. And if you're listening to this as boring history for sleep, don't worry. This chapter is calm, hushed, and heavy in that strangely soothing way truth sometimes is. As dawn broke over London, the streets told a different story than the night before. Torn hats, broken bottles, muddy dresses abandoned near doorways. For the wealthy, New Year's morning meant late breakfasts and gossip about who embarrassed themselves at which party. For the poor, it meant stepping over debris to find work that likely didn't exist. The calendar had changed, but life had not. Victorian newspapers loved to preach that New Year's Day was a moral reset. Editors wrote about self-improvement, temperance, and discipline. But the irony was brutal. The same society urging restraint had just spent the night encouraging excess. Drinking, gambling, reckless spending. And now, the consequences arrived quietly. Hospitals noticed it first. Admissions spiked on January 1st and 2nd. Alcohol poisoning, frostbite, injuries from street brawls and fireworks accidents. Doctors wrote notes about holiday injuries, a polite phrase for chaos-induced harm. For many laborers, missing even a single day of work because of injury meant no pay, no food, no heat. The new year didn't offer mercy. It collected debts. Meanwhile, debt collectors made their rounds. Victorian England ran on credit, especially among the working and lower middle classes. Shopkeepers allowed purchases on account through December, trusting customers to settle after the holidays. January was payday, or punishment. If you couldn't pay, goods were taken. Furniture, blankets, even cooking pots disappeared. The celebration ended, but the bill showed up right on time. Here's a twist people rarely talk about. New Year's Day was also eviction day in many cities. Rental contracts often reset at the start of the year. If rent hadn't been paid by January, families were pushed out into the cold. Imagine ringing in the new year at midnight and losing your home by noon. That wasn't rare. That was routine. Children felt it too. Victorian kids didn't get weeks of holiday joy. For poor families, New Year's meant children were sent back to factories, chimneys, and workshops immediately. No softness. No easing in. The bell that ended celebration was the same bell that demanded labor. Childhood didn't pause for tradition. And yet, this is where boring history gets quietly fascinating. People still clung to rituals. Even in hardship, Victorians believed fiercely in symbolic acts. Washing floors on New Year's morning to clean out bad luck. Opening windows to let the old year escape. Saying specific phrases before breakfast to ensure prosperity. These rituals weren't superstition alone. They were psychological survival. When you can't control your reality, you control your symbols. For women, especially working-class women, New Year's Day was exhausting. While men slept off hangovers, women cleaned messes, cared for sick relatives, and stretched leftovers into meals. Victorian morality praised women as the moral backbone of the home, but that praise came without rest or reward. The new year began with unpaid labor. And in the silence of the early afternoon, after the last drunk stumbled home, after the last church bell faded, there was a strange stillness, a collective exhale. the kind that feels peaceful on the surface but heavy underneath. This is why this history works so well as a sleeping channel topic. The violence isn't loud, it's structural, it's quiet, it hums. Here's the real shock. Suicide rates often rose in the days after New Year's. Historians link it to unmet expectations. People hoped the new year would change everything. When it didn't, when poverty, loneliness, and illness remained, the crash was emotional, not just economic. Hope, when crushed, leaves a deeper bruise than despair. Victorian England sold the new year as a promise. But for many, it was just a reminder. Time moves forward whether your life does or not. And that's where we'll pause. Because next we're going to explore something even darker and strangely calmer, the way Victorian society used sleep itself as an escape. Not rest, not comfort, escape. So stay with this boring history. Let it slow your breathing. Let the quiet cruelty fade into background noise. And when you're ready, we'll continue. When the final hour of December crept toward midnight in Victorian England, there was no roaring countdown, no glittering fireworks lighting the sky, no champagne popping in unison. The clock would tick, slowly, relentlessly, and for most people, nothing magical happened at all. This is the part of New Year's celebrations history rarely mentioned, the moment when hope peaked, and then quietly deflated. Perfect boring history. Perfect calm history. The kind of truth a sleeping channel whispers instead of shouts. For the wealthy, midnight was supposed to mean renewal. In grand houses, servants stood frozen in hallways as guests gathered around long case clocks. The room smelled of candle wax, wool coats, and heavy perfume. When the clock struck 12, polite applause followed. Maybe a toast, maybe a stiff hug. Then, almost immediately, conversation drifted back to politics, money, and social rank. The future had arrived, but it looked suspiciously like the past. For the poor, midnight often passed unnoticed. In cramped tenements, families slept through it entirely. Exhaustion beat celebration every time. If someone was awake, it was usually because hunger wouldn't let them sleep, or because factory shifts started before dawn on January 1st. New Year, same grind. The calendar flipped, but wages didn't rise. Bread didn't get cheaper. Life didn't reset. Here's the twist. Victorians believed deeply in symbolic moments. They trusted rituals. They trusted timing. Midnight mattered to them. That's why the disappointment cut deeper. When nothing changed, many blamed themselves. Had they failed the ritual? Had they forgotten a superstition? Had they welcomed the year incorrectly? One common belief was that your first action after midnight set the tone for the entire year. Step wrong, speak the wrong words, or encounter the wrong person. And the year was cursed. This anxiety turned midnight into a moment of pressure, not joy. People held their breath, hoping not to mess up the future in the first few seconds. In working-class neighborhoods, there was fear around who crossed the threshold first. A dark-haired man was considered lucky. A red-haired woman? Bad omen. A child? Neutral. An empty doorway? Disaster. Imagine starting the year already convinced fate was against you. That was Victorian optimism. Even kisses at midnight weren't romantic in the modern sense. They were transactional, almost defensive. A kiss was believed to ward off loneliness, not express love. Skip it, and you risked a year of emotional isolation. So people kissed out of obligation, not passion. Romance wasn't in the air. Anxiety was. Meanwhile, outside, the streets were eerily quiet. No mass celebrations, no public countdowns, just fog, gas lamps, and the echo of carriage wheels. Occasionally, church bells rang, not to celebrate, but to mark time. Bells didn't promise happiness. They reminded you that time was moving whether you were ready or not. And then came the morning of January 1st. This is where the illusion fully collapsed. Most Victorians woke up to debt, cold rooms, and the same problems as the day before. There were no holidays for factory workers, no paid time off, no new year, new me. Employers expected punctuality. Machines didn't care about resolutions. Newspapers printed hopeful editorials about progress and morality. But the streets told a different story. Beggars lined sidewalks, children sold matches. Workhouses filled faster in January than almost any other month. Winter plus disappointment was a brutal combo. This is the part history textbooks skip. They show elegance, not emotional whiplash. But New Year's in Victorian England was less about celebration and more about confrontation, staring directly at the gap between hope and reality. And here's the unexpected hook. This disappointment quietly shaped modern New Year's culture. The reason we obsess over resolutions today, gym memberships, productivity goals, reinvention, is because Victorians felt stuck. They wanted control over time itself. When the year didn't change them, they tried to change themselves. So when midnight failed, they internalized the failure. That mindset didn't disappear. It evolved. As the fog lifted on January 1st, Victorian England didn't cheer. It sighed. And then it went back to work. In the next part, we'll explore how this quiet disappointment gave birth to self-improvement culture, moral resolutions, and the pressure to be better every January, long before Instagram ever existed. Sleep on that thought. As the first daylight of January crept over soot-darkened rooftops, Victorian England confronted a harsh truth. The year had changed, but nothing else had. Streets remained cold, factories demanded labor, and households awoke to the same scarcity, sickness, and struggle that had defined the previous 12 months. For the upper classes, the day might have begun with a polite breakfast and soft chatter over tea. But for the working poor, January 1st meant the return of relentless responsibility. Workhouses demanded early arrivals, employers expected promptness, and children were sent back to workshops, chimneys, and mills without pause. Survival was immediate. Hope was delayed. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of, this unyielding reality, Victorians became obsessed with the idea of self-improvement, creating rituals and resolutions that transformed quiet desperation into structured ambition. The tradition of New Year's resolutions did not emerge from joy. It emerged from necessity. For many, the previous year had ended in debt, illness, or tragedy, and the turn of the calendar offered the illusion of control over a life that was otherwise unpredictable. Diaries from the 1840s London show families meticulously recording promises to themselves to save coins, to drink less gin, to attend church more faithfully, to teach children manners, or to endure hardship with greater patience. Even the smallest acts, scrubbing floors, tending gardens, mending clothes, were imbued with moral significance. Time was moral currency. Every second wasted was guilt accrued, and every minute spent deliberately was a step toward virtue. In an age where death and poverty lurked around every corner, the discipline of resolutions offered a sense of structure, an invisible shield against misfortune. Victorian society placed immense weight on appearances, and resolutions often carried performative power. Middle and upper-class families recorded their promises in journals or read them aloud at social gatherings. Failing to follow through was more than personal disappointment. It was a mark of social inadequacy. If a young man failed to honor his pledge to attend church, or a servant neglected a household duty, whispers could spread, reputations could falter, and judgment would follow. For the poor, resolutions were private struggles, small acts of hope against systems that were indifferent at best, cruel at worst. Yet even in these modest households, the act of promising to be better carried psychological weight. It was a coping mechanism, a ritual that allowed them to assert some measure of control over an otherwise uncontrollable environment. But resolutions were more than private exercises in virtue. They were reflections of societal values. Victorians believed that morality, discipline, and labor were inextricably linked to survival. Excess, indulgence, and idleness were sins that could lead to misfortune or even death. The very act of making a resolution implied acknowledgement of failure in the previous year and a commitment to improvement, a moral contract with oneself and with society. Drinking less, working harder, saving money, praying more. These were not merely habits. They were protective measures, structured attempts to navigate a world that offered no guarantees. The psychological weight of resolutions was intensified by the societal spectacle of New Year's itself. Midnight bells, fleeting revelry, and temporary chaos created a sharp contrast with the everyday grind. For a few hours, everyone seemed equal under the noise and smoke of the streets, sharing a collective release of tension. But when silence returned, the disparity was stark. The upper class retreated to warmth and security, while the working poor confronted immediate hardship. The failure of midnight to transform reality amplified the emotional intensity of resolutions. They became an urgent, almost desperate assertion that the coming year could be different, even if the evidence suggested otherwise. This tension between hope and reality also fostered an internalized discipline that would shape modern self-improvement culture. Gym memberships, moral guides, financial planning, and personal diaries. These habits have roots in the Victorian obsession with mastering oneself in the face of societal and environmental pressures. The rituals of New Year's, performed under conditions of scarcity, fear, and uncertainty, reinforced the notion that improvement was not a luxury, but a survival mechanism. Failure was not just a personal setback. It was a potential threat to livelihood, health, and social standing. The stakes were immediate, real, and unrelenting.
Children, too, absorbed these lessons. Even in moments when they were spared adult labor, they witnessed the quiet calculation and moral accounting of their parents. Every act of thrift, every hour of labor, every careful expenditure was a lesson in discipline. Early indoctrination into routines of self-improvement ensured that hope and pragmatism were intertwined from a young age. Education and play were subordinate to survival. Yet embedded within these routines were the seeds of resilience, planning, and moral consciousness that would echo through generations. And so, New Year's resolutions became a uniquely Victorian blend of ritual, morality, and desperation. They were never about indulgence, self-expression, or celebration. They were about control in a world that gave very little. The quiet rituals of cleaning, saving, working, and praying allowed individuals to feel mastery over their circumstances, even when external forces, poverty, disease, industrial labor, and social inequality remained merciless. By sunrise on January 1st, Victorian England was both unchanged and profoundly affected. Streets remained gray, homes remained cold, and factories demanded labor. Yet in the minds of those who survived, something had shifted, even if subtly. The act of making resolutions, of promising to be better, of imagining a slightly different future, became a form of rebellion against the unyielding structure of society. In that quiet, almost invisible way, hope persisted. Not in glitter or fireworks, not in lavish feasts or grand celebrations, but in the hushed, deliberate decisions that promised, however tenuously, that the next year could be, if only slightly, better. The quiet desperation of Victorian New Year's Day thus laid the foundation for centuries of self-improvement culture. What began as a response to hardship became a moral and psychological framework. Time is precious, life is fragile, and the future is a challenge to be mastered. Midnight may have been a hollow bell, but resolutions gave it resonance, echoing in diaries, prayers, and private vows long after the smoke cleared. Even when nothing externally changed, the ritual of self-betterment persisted, a fragile, human defiance against the relentless grind of reality.
As the new year unfolded in Victorian England, another layer of reality emerged, one that the bells, the fires, and even the crowded streets could never fully touch. It was the quiet suffering, the solitude that clung to people like a shadow, long after the revelry had died down. For many, New Year's Day was not about celebration, but about endurance in the face of relentless hardship. This was the hidden narrative of the season, the part that slipped between the pages of history and rested in the spaces between recorded events. For the poor, January 1st was a day of logistical survival. Children, often half asleep from long nights in overcrowded beds, were ushered out into the frosty air to fetch water, deliver messages, or work odd jobs for a few pennies. Each task was a reminder that the calendar had turned, but their circumstances had not. Families huddled around meager fires, sharing scraps of food and stories too small to lift the heart. The quiet moments between the chaos of midnight and the dawn of January 1st were often filled with fear and anxiety rather than reflection or hope. Survival was not glamorous. It was meticulous, exhausting, and unrelenting. Solitude was particularly harsh for the elderly. Pension or social safety nets were non-existent. Older Victorians, often widowed or abandoned, faced New Year's in silence, their homes cold and dimly lit. Letters of good tidings, if received at all, were brief and perfunctory. For them, midnight chimed not with promise but with memory. The echoes of years gone by, the absence of children or grandchildren, the stark reminder that time moved forward while opportunity and companionship often did not. Their experience underscores the quiet cruelty of Victorian society, a society that celebrated ritual and appearance but neglected emotional and practical welfare. Even among the working middle class, solitude was pervasive in subtler ways. Clerks, shop assistants, and factory supervisors often found themselves alone in offices or workshops long after the city's public celebrations faded. Papers needed finishing, ledgers balanced, and correspondence sent. The ritual of celebration existed alongside relentless obligation. For many, a solitary cup of tea or a brief glance at a candlelit street outside was the only acknowledgement of the New Year's transition. It was a quiet, private moment, a pause that revealed the relentless pace of Victorian life and the subtle but insidious pressure to remain productive, disciplined, and morally upright. Loneliness intertwined with economic pressure in ways that created a cycle of emotional exhaustion. Many households were single-parent homes or extended families struggling under the weight of debt, illness, or misfortune. The turning of the year did not bring relief. It brought bills, threats of eviction, or renewed labor demands. Letters of charity or employment notices might arrive days later, but the gap between need and assistance was measured in hours and sometimes lives. For the children of these households, the new year was a continuation of endurance, not a symbolic fresh start. The quietness of their suffering was profound, often unnoticed by a society more focused on appearances, rhetoric, and fleeting celebration. There were also psychological dimensions to this silence. Victorians, obsessed with moral self-improvement, often internalized failure when their lives failed to match their resolutions. A missed opportunity, a lost job, or an illness was interpreted as personal moral deficiency rather than circumstance. For those already burdened by poverty or grief, the gap between expectation and reality widened at the new year. The first day of January, ostensibly a moment of renewal, became a mirror reflecting inadequacy, exhaustion, and despair. Even when surrounded by family or neighbors, the emotional isolation could be immense, as the societal focus on propriety discouraged overt expressions of vulnerability. Yet, paradoxically, this very solitude was a form of resilience. By enduring the quiet suffering of New Year's Day, by rising early, tending to work, and managing households without the fanfare of recognition, Victorians forged a silent strength. They relied on ritual, superstition, and the faint hope embedded in tradition to maintain equilibrium. The symbolic acts of sweeping, opening windows, and making silent vows were both psychological coping mechanisms and quiet rebellions against a world that often seemed indifferent. By the end of January 1st, the city had resumed its rhythm. Streets cleared, taverns emptied, and chimneys continued to smoke. But in homes both large and small, the weight of solitude lingered. For those without companionship, wealth, or social support, the new year had arrived with no fanfare, only a reminder that time continued, indifferent to human struggle. Even for those surrounded by others, the pressures of expectation, moral duty, and economic necessity created pockets of quiet suffering that marked the day as much as any celebratory bell. And this is the critical lens through which Victorian New Year's must be understood. The holiday, outwardly loud and chaotic, hid the quiet moments where life's harsh truths were confronted alone. Beneath the revelry, beneath the smoke and fire lay an enduring lesson. Survival is often private, hope is fragile, and joy is provisional. The shadows of solitude stretched long into the year, shaping character, expectations, and the subtle rituals that defined Victorian life. In this silence, history whispers its most haunting truths. The loudest celebrations cannot erase private suffering, and the turning of a calendar cannot reset a life steeped in struggle. Victorian England's New Year's Day was never about guaranteed happiness. It was about endurance, resilience, and the quiet management of existence. And in the hushed aftermath of midnight, when streets emptied and fires burned low, the shadow of human solitude remained, patient, pervasive, and unrelenting. This is the side of history that rarely makes it into books or paintings. It is quiet, it is relentless, and it is profoundly human. As the last echoes of New Year's bells faded into the London fog, a curious silence fell over the city. The streets, once crowded with revelers, were now eerily empty, as if the night itself had swallowed the clamor. But the quiet was deceptive. Behind closed doors, the human drama continued, lives marked by struggle, hope, and fleeting moments of joy. Some families finally shared a meager meal in hushed satisfaction. Some children, exhausted, slept on straw-stuffed mattresses dreaming of a brighter tomorrow. And some elderly souls, staring into the dying embers of their fireplaces, whispered memories that no one would hear but themselves. Yet, just as the world seemed to settle into this uneasy calm, an unexpected twist revealed itself. A letter, lost in the shuffle of midnight chaos, was discovered by a humble street sweeper in a snow-dusted alley. Its contents were shocking. A wealthy benefactor had anonymously pledged aid to struggling families across the city, promising food, warmth, and work. What had seemed like a night of endless hardship now held the faint glimmer of transformation. The twist was cruelly beautiful. Just when despair seemed absolute, hope arrived in the most unexpected form. This final chapter reminds us that history is never as simple as it appears. Victorian New Year's celebrations were loud and public, but the real stories, the ones that shaped lives, were quiet, unseen, and deeply human. The contrast between the public spectacle and private reality teaches us something timeless. Joy can be transient, suffering persistent. And yet, in moments of chance, change can arrive when it is least expected. So, next time you watch fireworks or raise a glass to a new year, remember the hidden stories, the struggles and resilience of ordinary people, and ask yourself, what quiet triumphs might be unfolding right under our noses? If you found this journey into Victorian history fascinating, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Which hidden historical truth surprised you the most? And stay tuned.